Okay, well, today we're going to continue this theme of next steps for democracy on this subject of parliamentary reform, and we heard some interesting ideas yesterday on the House of Commons, and today the focus is the eternal focus on the Senate. And it's my privilege just to introduce the three people that are going to conduct this session for you. First of all, Ted Morton. Ted, why don't you come up here? Ted has served as Minister of Energy, Minister of Sustainable Development and Finance in the province of Alberta. He's a senior fellow with the Manning Foundation with particular responsibilities for energy and the environment. As most of you know, particularly those of you that were out to Calgary for the party convention, Ted organized a day-long seminar on reform or abolish the Senate and invited a number of people that have worked on this issue for years. They developed 6 options for moving forward on the Senate. That resulted in the creation of this website, reformorabolish.ca, which Ted is going to talk about, and Ted is going to moderate this discussion today. So thank you, Ted, for not just for this, but for your public service and particularly for the work that you've done on this issue. And then to discuss the 2 options, we have Jeremy Harrison, who is the government House Leader in the province of Saskatchewan. Jeremy was elected to Parliament at the age of 26, I think. You were one of the youngest members of ever to sit in the House. And then he was elected to the Saskatchewan legislature in November 2007. And as you know, the Saskatchewan government has been strong on the issue that the Senate has outlived its usefulness and should be abolished. And Jeremy's going to put forward that position. And then we're also very privileged to have Pierre Poilievre, who is, of course, the Secretary of State for Democratic Reform here in Ottawa. Pierre, great to see you. I think you were on my executive when you were a student in Calgary a long time ago. And of course, he now represents a seat down here. He's been re-elected 4 times, I think. And as the Secretary of State for Democratic Reform, he has responsibility for advancing the government's Senate Reform Bill, Bill C-7, and of course commenting on this issue from the standpoint of how to reform the Senate. So, gentlemen, we want to thank all of you for making yourselves available, and we look forward to your discussion this morning.
Thank you, Preston. This morning's session is the latest installment of something that began last summer, a dinner at Tom Flanagan's house. Roger Gibbons, our colleague from the Political Science Department at U of C and, of course, head of the Canada West Foundation for over a decade, has moved out to Vancouver. He was back in town. We had a dinner. And like a lot of people last spring, we were talking about, at some point during the dinner, the issue of the Senate came up. And out of that discussion came a sense that we were sort of at a crossroads. We were all old Reform Party, well, I guess Roger wasn't a reformer, but is certainly a strong supporter of Senate reform, the Reform Party, one of our key mandates. But we'd kind of reached an impasse. Provincial premiers haven't been, outside of Alberta, haven't picked up on Prime Minister Harper's offer to appoint senators who are duly elected through consultative elections at the provincial level. That seemed to be stalled, and of course, with the expense scandals and the media focus on the expense scandals in the Senate, there seemed to be growing, not just attention to the Senate, but also growing support for abolition, and as witnessed by Saskatchewan's position. And so we thought it would make sense to try to bring together people who worked on Senate reform and do a workshop on where we've been, where we are, and what are the options going forward. So with Preston's assistance, we convened a group of people at the Manning Foundation last October. It was a distinguished group in addition to people like Roger Gibbons and Tom Flanagan. We had Peter McCormick. Some of you would recognize Peter as one of the earliest articulators of the Senate reform movement. We had some senators. We had Betty Unger, who I think is here today. There's Betty right there. One of our elected senators from Alberta. And out of that, the quality of the presentations that day were so good that we've put them together. We edited and put them together. And with the help of Olivier Ballou, the recent father, you've seen the next member of the Ballou family this morning. We've put this all on a website called reformorabolish.ca. And out of these discussions, we've identified 6 options on a go-forward basis that we think Canadians face and the Harper government faces. And we've used the analogy of an old house in terms of what the options are. And so if you go to this website, which if you haven't already, I want you to, we want you to, we've given 6 options. The options are tear it down, major reno, minor reno, housekeeping, status quo, or deferred demolition. And of course, tear it down is abolish it now. The major renovation is basically the Triple E model, where you deal with the issue of equal representation or some more equal form of representation of the provinces plus election. The minor reno is essentially the C7 option that Minister Poilievre and the Harper government have before the House right now, and also on the reference to the Supreme Court. Housekeeping is just changes that don't require any constitutional changes. Status quo speaks for itself. Deferred demolition is a bit different. It would be a referendum to abolish the Senate now, but for the abolition not to take effect for 10 years. We can talk about that later. In any case, 10,000 people have already visited this website. They voted, and I'll give you an update on where that stands. In terms of results of the voting, I have it here. 41% have chosen the tear it down, which is the abolish now option. 29% have opted for the major reno, which is basically the Triple E model, and 11% for the minor reno, which is essentially the C7 bill that the Harper government has before the House. Only 2% have indicated support for the status quo. And I think I'll conclude by saying I think those results, and this is ongoing, but they capture the consensus of the workshop we had in Calgary last October, that a reform Senate for Canada would be better than no Senate. Canada remains the only large federal state without a functional second chamber. And also the additional advantage of a check and balance on the powers of any prime minister, any first minister. So the consensus was that a reform Senate is better than no Senate, but also that no Senate might be preferable to a continuation of the status quo. And that was a rough consensus of the group that met in Calgary at the Manning Foundation in October, and those seem to be the results that are coming in on the website. But if you haven't voted yet, go, reformorabolish.ca, vote, and you can, of course, we'd like you to be an informed vote. You can go as shallow or as deep as you want. The pros and cons of each option are listed. If you want more, you can see videos of the speakers, and if you're a real policy wonk, and I'm sorry to say this, but anybody showing up at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning to talk about Senate reform, you guys have pretty much described yourselves as policy wonks. The whole paper is there. You can read the whole darn thing. So please do that. Please vote. Vote early, vote often. And now we'll hear from 2 speakers that represent 2 of the opposing options. And I forget who's going to go first. I think it's Jeremy, right? Yeah. And the government of Saskatchewan, reflecting frustration, I think, on the part of Western Canadians and former supporters of Senate reform, are now supporting the tear it down, the abolish option. So over to you, Jeremy.
Well, it really is great to be here today, and this is a great weekend. I've got to catch up with so many old friends from Ottawa here and from around the country. I really want to thank Mr. Manning for the work that you have done in putting together, obviously, the Manning Centre, but also building this conference over a number of years into what it is now. I talked to Mr. Manning on the phone, I don't know, about 3 weeks ago, and we kind of run through a few items with respect to this session. So, of course, I phoned my dad right afterwards and said, "You're never going to believe who I just got to talk to on the phone." And he's like, "Well, who?" I said, "Well, I just got to talk to Mr. Manning." And Dad, in kind of his way, he's like, "Well, now you know what it feels like for a young guy to get called up from the AHL who ended up in the mid-'80s on the Oilers on Gretzky's line one time. I said, pretty much. It's also great to share this time with my friend Pierre. We go back a long ways. We were elected to Parliament actually in the same year, and before that had been through a number of political adventures in Alberta and around the country. So it's great to be here. I'm almost tempted to tell some stories about Pierre, but I'm afraid he would tell some about me. So I think we'll probably just stick to the Senate today. But what I want to say at the outset is that I'm a very reluctant abolitionist. I know Premier Wall is as well. I'm a conservative in every sense of the word. I believe strongly in the traditions of liberty and freedom that we have had the great fortune to inherit. I abhor the thought of constitutional vandalism with respect to altering institutions that are rooted in centuries, if not millennia, of tradition and history. However, we have to remember that our institutions have changed and evolved when necessary, and I believe that the change we propose is necessary and justified. I would also say at the outset that we do have something of an elephant in the room with respect to this matter. We have several questions in front of the Supreme Court of Canada right now who are going to be adjudicating on the appropriate constitutional provision in terms of either reform or abolition. Our government, government of Saskatchewan, one of only two provinces that did, fully supported the positions advanced by the government of Canada at the Supreme Court of Canada. We believe that the so-called 750 amending formula is the correct one with respect to abolition. Other provinces disagreed, including, surprisingly, I think, NDP governments who ostensibly support the position of abolition, but have taken the position that reform or abolition should be virtually impossible by requiring the unanimous consent of all the provinces. So I think that's an interesting question they should maybe be asked and asked to explain their position on. In Saskatchewan, we carefully considered the situation and concluded that the Senate is irreparably damaged. Our government didn't come to this position lightly. In fact, our party conducted a referendum on this issue not too many months ago. The question put to our members, the question that we asked essentially was what the future of the Senate should be. 87% of our members voted for abolition in Saskatchewan. Subsequent to that vote, Premier Wall introduced in our legislature a motion which was unanimously passed, an 11-word motion, quote, that this Assembly supports the abolition of the Senate of Canada. I voted this motion, I spoke to it, in fact, I drafted it. However, as I said, this was not an easy decision. I joined the Reform Party as an 18-year-old in part because I believed in Senate reform and believed that it could be done, that a Triple-E Senate would be the ideal. And in fact, I still believe that a Triple-E Senate would be the ideal. I think that most of us in this room have believed that for most of our political lives. Some I know still believe that it can be accomplished. The conclusion that I've come to, that Premier Wall has come to, and our government has come to, is that it simply can't. We've all tried. In 1998, the Reform Party Blue Book stated that, quote, we fully endorse the Triple-E concept. That was 25 years ago. It's important to acknowledge the leadership of Mr. Manning and many others in this room on Senate reform. They did the hard work. They explained, discussed, and refined that work in town halls across the country. They persuasively argued in favor of Senate reform in federal elections and within the House of Commons. Now let's consider the present. Prime Minister Harper has unequivocally demonstrated his commitment to Senate reform. He's appointed senators that support term limits. He's appointed senators who have been elected, Betty being one of them, whose campaign I worked on in 2000. We were just talking about that. He's genuinely tried to pass legislation that would reform the institution in small but important ways. But the ball hasn't moved. In fact, it's proven virtually impossible to hold senators accountable, on occasion, owing to the unwillingness of our own appointees to move the ball forward. The Senate's proven in the recent past that it cannot rule itself, but that's not the reason or catalyst for why we need to move forward with abolition. Perhaps a quick examination of the history of our own upper chamber is in order. It's interesting to reflect on the words of our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. He said this on the principle of equality in the Senate, quote, in the upper house, equality in numbers should be the basis, and the lower house, population should be the basis. It's interesting, the definition of equality at that time, before the nation's entire family came into existence, principally Western provinces, but also Newfoundland and Labrador, it wasn't the equality of the subnational units, it was regional. And at that time, I think that would be a reasonable measure of equality. But what happened in the intervening years, of course, is that many more provinces came into our national family. And as we all know, we ended up with a strange situation where a region like Western Canada would have the same number of representatives in the upper house as the region of Ontario. But of course, we know Ontario is not a region, it's a province. So you almost have this hybrid equality in terms of that particular E of the triple E's. We Westerners want this particular E. In fact, many believe it to be the most important one. We think about the equality of the provinces, not equality of regions, one province to another. And this isn't the fault of Ontario or Quebec, this is just how it's developed. And so I think the Senate has lost the opportunity then to provide the balance of a truly equal body. The House of Commons is representative of the people. The Senate, if it's working, should be representative of the subnational units, the provinces. And what did John A. have to say of effectiveness, the second E? Well, here's a brief quote from the Confederation's debate. He said, quote, "It would be of no value whatever were it a mere chamber for registering the decrees of the lower house." John A. Macdonald was saying the Senate wouldn't be much good if it was just a rubber stamp. The Senate should actually be an effective voice for regional representation. We know that for the most part, not always, but for the most part, throughout these decades, a rubber stamp is what the Senate has been. Part of the reason for that is that senators are part of their respective parliamentary caucuses. They're going to be part of a government caucus. They're going to be part of an opposition caucus. And for the most part, they'll vote the party line of those respective caucuses. And that's the way it works. Despite Justin Trudeau's fantasy attempt at renaming the Senate Liberal Caucus to the Liberal Senate Caucus, we know they're still Liberals and they're going to vote like Liberals. But by these two measures, the Senate's failed the test of being equal. It's also failed the test of being effective. There's been important work done by the Senate. I know I want to make very clear that this is not in any way a criticism of those that have been called to serve in the upper chamber, the vast majority of whom do so with great diligence, great integrity, and do fantastic work. But we have to ask ourselves, could the work they've done that we consider worthwhile be done without it? I would submit that the provinces do this in our systems, our unicameral systems. Our standing committees and special committees have been designed to do this. The House of Commons, I believe, could do it as well. There's the chance for a sort of thoughtful discussion and the sober second thought that's often touted as one of the attributes of our Senate. Some have asked what would happen in our country if there's a prime minister or a federal government that decides to undertake policies that are particular harm to a region, maybe in our case, Western Canada. With the Senate gone, would we have lost our last line of defense? Again, I think it's important that we canvass our own recent history with that same question, because there have been examples where a federal government has undertaken actions that have hurt a region. We need to look no farther than the National Energy Program. A policy obviously massively damaging, not just to Alberta, but to the entirety of Western Canada. I'm sure there were senators at the time who decried the policy, who opposed the policy, but I can't tell you who they are. I don't remember their names. There is a name I do remember, though, Peter Lougheed. When it came to that particular battle against the National Energy Program, I remember a premier's name. Because what in practice has happened in our country is that the provinces have filled a vacuum left by the Senate. A Senate that maybe John A. wanted to be equal, a Senate that maybe John A. wanted to be effective, but which has been neither. Because of parliamentary whip votes, party discipline, because of the nature, the appointments of the Senate, and because of the regional representation, not provincial. For all of those reasons, the de facto balance to a federal government has been the provincial governments of the country. The NEP didn't die immediately, we know that, but the provincial voice within Confederation, not the Senate, proved to be the balance against the heavy-handed federal government. So, if we believe, as I do now, that the status quo is not on, and I think there's great consensus across the country to that effect, and Dr. Morton just mentioned only 2% on reform or abolish.ca support the status quo. If we think the status quo isn't on, I think that there are three options, and I know there's others that have been put out there, but we see it as there being three options. The first is a reformed Triple E Senate. Second is a marginally reformed or incrementally reformed Senate, and the third is abolition. With respect to number one, as I've said, and the Premier's said repeatedly, we still believe that a meaningfully reformed Senate, specifically a Triple E Senate, would be the ideal. We have, though, as I said, come to the considered opinion that this is just not going to be possible to implement. Premier Wall's now the second longest serving current Premier in Canada. I know he's never heard a Premier of one of the largest provinces say that they support a Triple E Senate. Even when those provinces were at their most generous with respect to the Senate during each lake, even then, when they were prepared to move on the Senate, they weren't prepared to move to a triple E. I know my Premier wouldn't blame them. How would you explain that to your citizens? That if you've given up one of the advantages you have in a major institution of Parliament. The reality is that it's just not going to happen. What about a marginally reformed Senate where we elect some and perhaps put term limits on some others? I think there's some problems with that. Not all the provinces are going to elect senators. We know that. In fact, hardly any of them are. So then what would you have? Well, you'd have a kind of hybrid Senate with a tiny minority elected, giving some legitimacy to an institution whose huge majority would be appointed in the same old way. What else is wrong with the marginally reformed Senate, as I've understood it, is that you still have an appointment that runs to the age of 75. You run for office once and you stay there. I think elected members and former elected members in this room know that we have a lot more focus in our work because we are going to be facing another election, because we do have to go back to our electorate and explain why we took certain positions. And the last option, abolition, I believe it's the cleanest and most doable of the reforms. That being said, I'm under no illusions about how difficult this will be. Perhaps this is a politically impossible option as well. But I do believe it's more possible than obtaining consensus for any other measure. There may have been no premiers from large provinces that said they desire a Triple E Senate, but there have been some that have favored abolition, at least rhetorically, and I would point to Premiers McGuinty and Campbell. If the Supreme Court comes back and does say 750, if we have a British Columbia, we have an Ontario on board with abolition, there's at least hope that we could reach the 750 constitutional threshold. We're just not going to get there on Triple E or find consensus on the myriad of other proposals that we see almost daily in editorial pages across the country. And that's why, despite the great difficulty, perhaps insurmountable difficulty of having any reform at all, I do believe that that's the most doable reform. Some have advocated even for abolition of the current Senate with a view to starting over. That's something I could support. That's something our government could support. As Andrew Coyden said, in favoring this scenario, and I quote, "Even if the attempt failed, we should at least be rid of the Senate as it is, sparing the country the embarrassment of an appointed House, well known as a den of patronage even without its recent ethical lapses, substituting its wishes for those of the democratically elected Commons." The people don't support the status quo. We know that. The status quo is an anachronism. It's not good enough for Canadians. We need to move forward, and I believe we need to specifically consider abolishing the Senate of Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you to Preston Manning for making this possible and for giving me my start in politics. It is great to be here today in this room. I fear, however, that it is probably a divided room. Some of you support abolition, some of you support reform, and then there's a small group of you who want a Senate seat for yourselves. I can't offer you one. In times like these, I look to John A. Macdonald for speaking points. He would have said, some of my best friends are for Senate abolition, some of my best friends are for Senate reform. As for me, I stand with my friends. Speaking of friends, it's great to be here with an old friend, Jeremy Harrison. We were elected on the same day in 2004. This is deja vu. I remember we were walking up to the Centre Block building between the Eternal Flame and the Peace Tower, and I looked up in awe and I said to Jeremy, "I can't believe that I'm here. What about you?" He said, "I agree. I can't believe you're here either." That's kind of how I feel today. I can't believe that we're here. 10 years has gone by, and nothing has changed in Canada's upper chamber. In fact, in 147 years, nothing has changed in the upper chamber. You know, the Wright brothers invented heavier-than-air flying machines, what we call airplanes today, over 3 decades after the Senate was created. In fact, women have been given the vote. We've helped defeat communism, Nazism, and fascism, fought 2 world wars, invented the telephone, the automobile, the internet. We've gone from a country of 3.6 million people in 4 provinces to 10 provinces with 35 million people. And in all of that time, the Senate has not changed. The only constitutional change that has happened since its birth is that the Senate has gone from a lifelong appointment to an age 75 limit. I think that change happened when most people weren't even living to age 75. The only Democratic Senate reform that has happened has come from Alberta, where the provincial government has held advisory elections and prime ministers have appointed the winners to the upper chamber. Some of them are still there today, and God willing, they will not be the last. Speaking of which, we have Ted Morton here today. He ran in one such election when he was a professor and I a student at the University of Calgary, and he actually won that election. He's a great paradox. Most people go to the Senate without getting elected. He got elected and never went to the Senate. You know, time has rolled on, and some believe that we're out of time. The Saskatchewan and its successful Premier Wall are now driving the Senate debate. Regardless of what you think of abolition, the Wall government speaks. When the Wall government speaks, the entire country should listen. They have balanced the budget, cut income and property taxes, paid off $3 billion in debt. No wonder they have by far the lowest unemployment in Canada. And unlike Justin Trudeau, they understand that the budget will not balance itself. These economic achievements for Saskatchewan add extra credibility to anything the government says on any subject. And the Wall government understands what the NDP ignores, which is that abolition is a provincial and ultimately not federal decision. Yes, it would require a parliamentary approval, but it would also require at least 7 legislatures representing 50% of the population to do it. Premier Wall's push for abolition, I believe, may ultimately help us achieve reform, because it sounds the alarm to defenders of the status quo. When the Saskatchewan legislature, under the leadership of Canada's most popular premier, unanimously and across party lines adopts a motion for abolition, the message is clear. If we do not bring democracy to the upper chamber, credible provincial leaders, whether I like it or not, will take legal steps to close the place down. So why do I stand here today to defend the continued existence of the Senate? Because I believe in democratic bicameralism. A democratic upper house can do what the lower house cannot. Where the Commons speaks for the population, a democratic Senate would speak for the regions. And on this point, Jeremy mentioned that the major opponent of the National Energy Program was Peter Lougheed, and he is in fact right. And he asked the name of a senator who spoke out against it, and I can think of one. Ernest Manning was a loud and proud opponent of the National Energy Program and a strong voice on behalf of Alberta. Imagine if he had been joined by a group of elected Democratic Western senators who could have represented their constituents along with him in the way that he had done after having served as one of Canada's most successful ever premiers. A Democratic Senate would also be entirely separate from the executive, whereas the House necessarily blends members of both the executive and legislative branches. And the Senate, with longer terms than the House, would have the ability to look farther down the road in the decisions that it votes on. But for it to do any of these things, it must be elected. To make it so, we propose the Prime Minister should appoint only those who have already won senatorial elections. Prime Minister Mulroney started this tradition when he appointed Stan Waters, for whom Albertans had already voted. Prime Minister Harper has since done so with 4 additional elected senators, among whom is Betty Unger, who's with us today. Is this a perfect solution? Of course not. True, it does not provide a fairer allocation of seats to the individual provinces, but nor does the status quo. True, future prime ministers may choose to disregard it, appointing whomever they like in the future. All the more reason for us to set the convention in place now so that it is so strong that it becomes unthinkable for a prime minister to ever reverse it. Yet some say it is too slow. Welcome to Canada, I respond. This is a country, after all, that does change in the British tradition, by evolution, not the American and French tradition, which is revolution. We do things carefully and slowly. We were founded in 1867, yet it took 64 years for Parliament to receive legal autonomy and war declaration powers in the Statute of Westminster of 1931. In fact, at that time, the mother country was actually offering us more independence than we were willing to accept. Canada did not accept the ability to have its own domestic court of last appeal until 1949, 82 years after Confederation, during which time the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in Britain played that role. It took 115 years for us to patriate our own Constitution and Charter. It took us that long, and we had a head start, because the British motherland of our democracy had carried the democratic baton 6.5 centuries forward. In fact, our democracy began its long gestation in 1215, and at the end of this mandate of our government, we will celebrate the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, that great English Charter of Liberties that began to put the rule of law above the rulers of the land. And we inherit that tradition of incremental, sometimes frustratingly slow transfer of power from the few to the many. One institution has not been part of that power transfer, and we hope to change that. The Prime Minister in that effort has referenced to the matter to the Supreme Court to seek a legal instruction manual on Senate reform. We've asked the Court some questions. Can Parliament amend the term limits using Section 44 of the Constitution? We argue yes. Can Canadians, as Albertans have done, vote on who they want the Prime Minister to appoint to the upper chamber? We argue yes. Are 7 provinces representing 50% of the population enough to abolish the Senate? We argue yes. As we wait the outcome of the Senate reference, it is important to stand on guard against ideas that would evolve the Senate in the wrong direction. It is hard to think of a worse process for naming senators than we have right now, but amazingly, Justin Trudeau has found one. He's recycled an old idea whereby a committee of well-connected elites would pick senators. Under the plan, not only would senators be unelected, those who pick senators would be unelected. So an unelected, unaccountable body would appoint an unelected, unaccountable body, which will become 2 steps removed from democracy instead of just 1. The members of this proposed appointment commission would presumably be human, possessing all of the same human frailties of everyone else. They would have friends to help, favors to repay, advantages to seek. The only difference is that this bureaucratic cronyism would be done in the dark instead of where Canadians can see and judge it. Because the average person would have no idea who these people are, they would have no idea how to judge the relationships behind the appointments that it makes. Imagine the concentration of power and the insult that goes along with this policy. If you have the Senate and the House of Commons with roughly equal legislative powers. One is elected by 25 million Canadians. The other would be appointed by 25 Canadians. Each one of these appointment commissioners would have the mathematical power of 1 million Canadian voters. What an insult to the intelligence of the Canadian people. It would be government of the elites, by the elites, for the elites, not exactly the stuff of the Gettysburg Address. If there is one thing that liberal elites hate more than the idea of a Conservative Prime Minister who's elected appointing senators, it is the thought that everyday Canadians might have a say. But we will continue to work to give them that say. We must continue step by step on that long journey that started so many centuries ago to transfer power from the privileged few to the deserving many. That is our goal, and we hope you'll join us in doing it.
So we have about less than 10 minutes for a little discussion here, so we'll ask participants to be short and to the point, but of course terribly insightful. But I think, Jeremy, the weakness of the abolition position is that while it's simple to understand, it's complicated to do. And the opposition to abolition, at least it being pursued as a government option, is that it would involve, let's, for the sake of argument, whether the Supreme Court says it's a 7-10 amending formula or unanimity. If it says unanimity, it's obviously not worth pursuing at all. But even 7-10, at this point in Canada's evolution, at this point in the Harper government's term, do we want Senate abolition put on the table for a major national debate?
Right. No, well, I think that's a very good point. And as I said in my remarks, whether it's even doable at 750 is a very open question. You know, I think the only practical way, if we were to move forward with the, I mean, seeing if we get back 750 from the Supreme Court, that's an open question right there too. If it is unanimous, well then obviously it's not possible at any rate. But if we get 750 back, I think the political answer is that a question put before the people in terms of their view, a referendum on their view of the future of the Senate, with abolition being an option. I think if you had that referendum, if you had obviously the official opposition supporting that position, if the government were to move to that position, I think you would end up with a very significant majority of Canadians that would also end up there as well. And I think that would, you know, in practice be the only way that you could pressure provincial governments to put that question into their assembly. Otherwise, I just don't think it's going to happen. For most provincial politicians, regardless of stripe, and Premier Wallace said this, and I would agree with it, on the list of top 10 issues that you're dealing with provincially, this is about number 15. And for a provincial government to actually go through the process of putting a government motion on the order paper, devoting a number of House days to a debate, which, you know, to most people isn't that important, from a House leader's perspective, that's important. So you're going to have a pretty overwhelming consensus in order to do that. So I think that's the only way it would happen.
Well, I'm, like many people, I'm sympathetic to the idea of a referendum to create a moral force that would pressure particularly provincial governments to act on the Senate issue. But reluctantly, I have to concede to those who defend either the status quo or C7 that do we really want to open up the Constitution again, because we all remember the Meech and Charlottetown syndrome. And at this point, as I said, in Canada's history, the problems that we face as a nation, and in terms of the mandate of the Harper government, do we want to go down that road? Minister Poilievre, the merits of C7 and what your government's proposing is that presumably it does not require a if the Supreme Court concedes to your argument, at least in terms of consultative elections and term limits, right? And your position has the advantage of it rejects the defeatist position that you can't do anything unless you do everything, right? It's a step forward. We keep a Senate. It's a small step forward, the Canadian way maybe. But it seems pretty clear that most provincial premiers have not been eager to accept Prime Minister Harper's offer with the consultative elections to appoint the winners of that. Would you be open, or would you consider the possibility of the Prime Minister saying on a go-forward basis, we'll let, as the Senate vacancies come open, we'll let the Premier of whatever province there, let them appoint them, and just, or nominate them, and then Prime Minister Harper, will then confirm that. And that sounds crazy at first, but who are they going to appoint? Are they going to appoint cronies?
Yes.
Well, yes, but then who will attack them? The opposition parties. Right now, there's no way for the Prime Minister and the federal government to put any pressure on premiers to get behind Senate elections. If premiers suddenly had to make appointments, and if they started abusing it, then it would give an incentive for the opposition parties to challenge that and maybe get on side for elections. In other words, start the debate at the provincial level by throwing the issue to them.
Look, my view is that as long as senators are appointed by politicians, that we don't have a democratic upper chamber, and it doesn't matter which politician makes the appointment. It is still an unelected body. That is to say nothing about the merits of Canada's first ministers. It is just the nature of an appointed body. Our policy is that there should be democratic consultations whereby Canadians have an opportunity to vote on who should represent them in the upper chamber. Actually, the proposal you just mentioned was debated in Parliament in 1874. MP Mills from Ontario proposed it. It was ultimately withdrawn at that time, but I ultimately don't think that we should proceed with it. I believe that C7 or some other consultative election is the best way to move incrementally towards a democratic upper chamber.
Okay. With that comment, we're actually at the end of our allotted time. Both our speakers and myself were happy to stick around and talk to people individually afterwards. But let me take this opportunity to thank both of you for coming this morning, and thank all of you for getting up and coming to an 8:30 session on that riveting subject of the eternal subject of Senate reform. Thank you.